Hi, this is the first video in a three-part series dedicated to my 2022 performance patch. This video is more of an explainer video, so a lot of talking, not a lot of sounds from the synth. The second video, I'll kind of go through each piece and the transitions and show you sort of what they're comprised of and how I navigate from piece to piece. And then the third video will be an actual performance of the entire set that I did on tour. So why did I decide to make this video? Well, I just finished a series of 12 concerts over the summer, several of which are on the West Coast. And there were a lot of audience members that had questions about the patch and performing with modular synth, so that's one reason. Another reason is because I just know that people are generally interested in how one might perform with this instrument. And another reason is because, well, it's a difficult thing to say goodbye to. I just performed 12 shows with it. I rehearsed in between some of those shows, created it and rehearsed a lot prior to the first show. I spent a lot of time with it, and it's difficult to say goodbye. And so this is a way for me to kind of document it more thoroughly before I unplug and before moving on to new material. So it's kind of a gift to my future self, if you will. As I mentioned, there will be 2 other videos in this series, so keep on the lookout for those. So here's a background to the patch and how it evolved to what you see here. So it all started with the idea of small performance patches. I called them patch seeds. Patch seeds are just these simple starting points to build upon for every single piece in the performance. A few examples of patch seeds include using an analog shift register. And that shift register, that analog shift register, would be the centerpiece and starting point of that particular work, that particular track. I got this idea from Keith Fullerton Whitman because I'm a big fan of his, and he used analog shift registers for a long period in his work. Another example is using marbles, as you see here, to just control a variety of voices and events in the patch. A more abstract or like kind of left field idea would be to take an output of DPO and run it into the René sequencer so that the René ran at audio rate, which is not a brand new idea or anything, but it's not done probably all that often. It's a little bit of a weirder way to approach a sequencer. So the ideas for the patch seeds they kind of went from the more simple to the more left field or abstract kind of approaches. So I didn't know for sure, but I had 3 ways I thought I might proceed with this idea of patch seeds. The first one was to memorize them and to patch them from scratch in front of the audience. These patch seeds would be built upon and explored anew for every show. They're either patched up one at a time or all patched up right at the beginning of a set. So, like I said, the patch seeds would have to be simple. And the whole patch process would be seen and heard from the very beginning of the performance. And I was very excited by this idea. Okay. The second idea was the same, except for the 4 or more patch seeds just stayed intact the entire tour. And I didn't do a patch from scratch aspect. And to achieve this, they were probably going to have to be like, my entire system would probably have to be broken up into different sections where the patch seeds were operating in. And maybe some cross-patching of the sections, if that makes sense. So kind of isolating certain sections of the synth. So let's say this section was one patch seed, this section was one patch seed, or something like that. And the final idea was just one large patch that had these patch seeds kind of integrated, and I just thoroughly studied every single knob and every single switch and learned to improvise with it and maybe do some what I think of as expansion patching, where I patch on top of the primary stuff and, do some patching in real time. This one kind of loses maybe some of the patch seeds ideas, but it still is kind of connected in that the patch seeds would be buried in there somehow. So these were very loose ideas, and I didn't really know what direction I would go. How it evolved? Well, I figured out that with my current set of tools, the patch seeds idea did not prove fruitful. It took too long to come to ideas that I really wanted to explore, but I figured out that I really like to come to ideas in kind of a weird way. I like to try out various things and then kind of discover the sound that I want to explore further. So the patch seeds idea just took too long to come to get to these places where that I really wanted to explore, and I didn't want to do that in front of the audience, to take just so long to get somewhere. I felt like if my set was 40 minutes, it would have been like 25 or so minutes of trying to get somewhere, and then 15 minutes of really, really being happy with my set. So that didn't feel right. Maybe I'll pursue the patch seeds idea in the future. Especially after adjusting this case a little bit, switching some modules in and out, maybe I can come back to that idea. But at some point in this process of preparing for my shows, I gave up on the patch seeds idea. I really did start over several times, and I really wanted to give it a try, but just didn't work out. So what I decided to do was to just simplify, and not get so caught up. I was running out of time too, and I was getting a little stressed. So I decided to have one simple goal, which was create one single piece or track. This would be a loose piece that had a lot of room for improvisation. And I didn't want to do like too many weird ideas in the patch, so that I could use it as a basis to build upon for the other tracks. And luckily, once I decided on this, I started getting results I liked really, really quickly. And I found myself building up several pieces in rapid succession. And with each piece, the patch grew a little more complex. So this leads me to the next topic, really, which is this concept of the zone. So once I gave up on the patch seeds idea, and I had created one or two tracks that were feeling really, really good, it suddenly occurred to me this concept of the zone. And the zone is very similar to a lead sheet that you find in jazz. And so a lead sheet, just very briefly, is usually one sheet of paper. The music usually has two sections or more or less. And the music consists of the main melody of the song and the main harmonies of the song. And jazz musicians use this as the introduction to the piece, oftentimes the closing. They come back to the lead sheet a few times throughout the piece, and the material in that, the melody and the harmony, is the primary source material for the improvisations they do. And that's very similar to this concept of the zone. The difference is, though, is I would kind of improvise my way into the zone, and then upon arriving I would improvise within the zone, and then I would improvise my way out of the zone and into the next one. So the zones were another way of just thinking of or another word for piece of music, but this kind of loose type that I could improvise with. So I hope that makes sense, the concept of the zone. So let's talk about the fundamental elements of the patch. So there are 4 melodic voices and 3 percussive voices. The melodic voices include the make noise DPO, the 4MS ensemble oscillator, mutable instruments rings, and mannequins mangrove. DPO is mostly used as the primary voice. Rings I am not using as a resonator, I'm just using as a voice, which is very common. Rings serves as a secondary melody to the main melody, or sometimes it is the main melody. Really, these two kind of trade off and work together. And mangrove is the bass, almost exclusively, and then chord tones mostly from a little bit of chord progression from 4MS ensemble oscillator. On the percussion side, 2 voices come from the taisodaico, a kind of kick drum voice on channel 1 and a kind of snare drum voice on channel 2. That module is by ALM, FYI, just in case you didn't know anyway. And then the other percussive voice is a hi-hat that I made. And I created it using a noise output on Steady State Fate's Quantum Rainbow 2 module, and then just envelope and VCA. Just a simple hi-hat. No filter, which is unusual, but I just didn't have the space, and I found with the blue noise out in particular, it wasn't too harsh without a filter. It somehow worked. That's the voices. So another important thing with the patch is color coding. As you can see with the DPO, quite easily, all the cables going in and out are red. And this really helped me whenever I was performing to be able to see things quickly and trace a voice really quickly. So briefly, the color codes are red for DPO, everything to do with the DPO, as long as it only has to do with the DPO, is red. So it's envelopes, it's whole signal path. Anything that's controlling the DPO in any way is red. Next up, I use pink for rings, so everything pink has to do with rings. You start to notice maybe that the stackable cables do not conform to the colors that I need. But I know I could switch brands. There are some other options now, but this is what I have. So the stackable colors unfortunately kind of complicate things, but that's okay. It's not a perfect system, but it works pretty well. Next up, white for ensemble oscillator. So everything white has to do with ensemble oscillator. Unfortunately, I started with orange for mangrove, as you can see, but I ran out of orange cables, so I had to do a combo of purple and orange. Once again, not a perfect system, but I got the job done. Blue, taisodaico channel 1, green, taisodaico channel 2. Yellow is hi-hat. Next up, I have a few subgroups. The clear is an audio subgroup. So anything with clear means it's affecting a group of voices. So in this case, I believe what's going into mimeophone is the DPO and rings via dynamics. So that's why these are the clear color, the transparent color. Then gray is another subgroup. It's modulator modulations. So any modulators such as Wogglebug, if they're getting modulated by something else, then there you'll see gray. You'll see gray cables. Okay. And then I have a master clocks group, and that's brown. So it's very easy to see my master clock signal flow. And then the last one is the black group, which are the master signals. So this is my main output, or the really important almost final parts of the signal. So that's actually 11 different colors that I'm using. All right, another fundamental element is the signal flow. And, modular synth is just kind of a network, so there's no left to right signal flow like you might have with guitar pedals generally and other musical instruments. But some important aspects of the signal flow is how I decided to route into the mixer. So the top half of Steady State Fate's Vortices mixer are stereo channels, and the bottom half are mono channels. And so I use the top half for my melodic voices, and I use the bottom half for my percussive voices. And so channel 1 is the output of mimeophone, which is DPO, and rings, like I mentioned before, via Dynamix. They're going into Dynamix, and then Dynamix's output is going into mimeophone. Okay, so that's channel 1. Channel 2 is 4MS ensemble oscillator. Channel 3 is mangrove, which first passes through QPAS. Moving on to the percussive voices. By the way, the reason why I put them into this mono side of vortices, the mono half, is that I really wanted control over the panning on a few of them in particular. So the first channel is the hi-hat, and that has some CV over the panning, which I really love doing, and it's coming from the Y output on marbles, which is a slow, smooth, random source. And I believe I am using it in its default mode, which is its, I'm going to forget now, but I think it's 16 times slower than this, than the rate that you have set. Okay, hopefully that's correct. And then channel 2, as the blue is telling me, is the Taiso Daiko, which is the kick drum out of Taiso Daiko. Channel 3 I'm not using, and channel 4 is the more snare drum-like sound from the Taiso Daiko. So hi-hat that I created, kick drum from Taiso Daiko, snare drum from Taiso Daiko. And this one, channel 4, is also getting some pan modulation here, and that is just an inverted version of the same source of the other pan that I mentioned, so the marbles Y output. So that way the hi-hat and the snare move in opposite directions. It's one of those effective but set and forget things. Alright, so next up is how I'm using the effects. So we already mentioned mimeophone has DPO and rings running through it. Morphogene takes the output of the stereo channels from vortices. So it's all the melodic voices. This is cool, so I get to record all the melodic voices. I do a lot of granular effects to them, and that goes into channel 1 of the Befaco stereo mixer. So all my melodic voices get processed by Morphogene and go into channel 1 here. The beads is the takes the output of the mono half of vortices, so it's processing all of the drums, and that goes into channel 2 of the stereo mixer. So once again, all the drums get processed by beads, and then the output of the Befaco stereo mixer goes into Desmodo's Versio by Noise Engineering, a stereo in and out reverb module. And that finally routes, so everything gets the same reverb applied, and then that finally goes out to my master output module by Noise Engineering as well, which goes and connects to the house PA system. This module is very useful. It has the headphone output, which I will use, like, you know, when I'm tuning and preparing the set and checking in on my set before I actually perform. But I actually switch this output, and I put in I plug in my recording device here. Unless the room I'm in just happens to have really terrible sound, which only happened once or twice when I was performing. In that case, I actually will use headphones when I'm performing. If I can't rely on what I'm hearing, I gotta use a better speaker system. And then with I just place my recording device out in the audience somewhere and record the room sound, which can be pretty cool. So it was really great carrying around a recording device because I walked out with something like 10 or 11 of the shows recorded. The reason why I don't have all of them is that I did run out of batteries a couple of times, and so yeah, there were a few problems, but that covers the signal flow, how the effects work, voices, and everything like that. Next up, a super important part of the patch is how I use Make Noises Renee and Tempi modules and the Ellis module by Livestock Electronics. So Renee and Tempi, they communicate via the select bus, and so that you can select these different states, and it selects the same state on both modules. So it works really well together. It's really important to the way I work generally. Ellis is a preset module, and I use that in conjunction with these modules. So what I mean is state 1 here is the same as state 1, preset 1 here, 2, 3. So these work together. I could mix them up and stuff, but I did prepare my set this way. Once I get to state 9 on the Renee, I have to go into the yellow bank on the Ellis, but I just keep moving like that all the way through. I don't actually use these two states here in performance. It was a track that I ended up not liking, and I needed to cut one. So let's go back to here, and I'll explain why the Renee is here later. Let's see, I guess I should say really quickly that Renee is used sometimes as a regular sequencer, but a lot of times I'm using the CV inputs to do very different things to the sequence. So I might be using it more as a quantizer, or just a collection of pitches that I navigate through, almost like a table of pitches that I navigate through in various ways with the CV that's coming in. So it's not always really being used as a normal sequencer. Also, even when it is, the clocks are going under a lot of processing, and so the results of this are really sometimes quite varied. So the Ellis, it's a preset module, and what it's mostly doing here is it's just sending out offsets that open up VCAs or close them. And that's allowing different modulations to pass through a VCA because it's opening up the VCA. And that allows more randomness in some cases to be spread up throughout the patch. It functions in various ways, but mostly opening up VCAs. Another primary thing is it does change a lot of the parameters on marbles, which is such a core to this patch, and such an important element, I should say, to the patch, that it really changes quite a lot of things as well. Another fundamental element of the patch is how I use randomness and chaos. There are actually 3 random modules in this system, and they're giving me 3 different flavors of randomness. Marbles, which is, I'm not going to go into how it works, but what's special about it in this case is that it can lock. You can repeat back what was random now becomes sort of a loop. There's the wobble bug, which I guess you could say is a little bit more of a traditional random module. Very unique actually, but it is, different types of random with a clock. And then Orbit 3 by Jor Analog is a module based on chaos theory, the actual mathematic study of chaos and how that works, which is it's not really random in the pure sense anymore. It's a whole different thing, and I highly recommend to read about chaos theory, Orbit 3, and anything to do with the differences between random and chaos. So that gives me that flavor of randomness, even though it's not really random. Okay, so now These three are doing a variety of things in the patch that are important. Orbit 3 is I'm mostly hands-off with it. Actually, with all three of these, I'm not doing a lot of touching throughout the performance because I have them just running and doing important things in the patch. And a lot of those things are closed behind they're running through a VCA and they're closed off until a certain preset in Ellis opens up the VCA and allows those signals to control modules. Another important fundamental element of this patch are two pedals that are off screen. Let me grab them. A sustain pedal and an expression pedal. The sustain pedal is super important. It chokes the tempo. It stops the tempo, allows me to have silence in my set, which is extremely important because, well, it's extremely important to me because I want dynamics, I want silence, I want expression, a really expressive set. And modulars just keep running generally, and most people's sets just sound that like they just won't stop. They're just constantly going, and so I didn't want that. I wanted to have the ability to just stop. So when I press this, you'll notice the clock stops. How does this work? It actually runs into the modular system via this ADAC module here called floor control. And as you can see, as I'm holding this down, Tempi has stopped running. This buffered mult that has the main clock running into it is just stuck at its current state. There's probably a few other things one might notice via the LEDs, but once I let go, you'll notice in particular Tempi will start flashing again. There's also some artifacts sometimes in how the clock some of the clocks restart, and it creates some almost like bursts of noise, which can be actually really cool. And I got so into it that I started using it in a few of the pieces as a very important compositional element. But anyway, choke the clock. I'm doing this by running the clock through a VCA. There you go. Okay, the expression pedal, aka volume pedal, is really just going directly, well, passing through here, and going directly into the regen CV input on the reverb. And that's just the tail of the reverb, so the decay. This was useful whenever my hands were busy doing other things, but I wanted to increase the decay, which can be used to really, for a variety of purposes, but of course to build up drama. So that brings us to the end of this first video. We covered sort of why I made the video and the background to this patch and the fundamental elements of the patch. I hope that gave you some insight and was useful to you in some way. Next up, I'll actually go through what it's sort of like whenever I arrive at a show and turn things on, and how I tune, which is a huge thing I really had to kind of build into the patch, a way to tune, which I'll talk about. And I'll talk about the score or my performance notes. And I'll actually show you sort of how I navigate to each individual piece and how I even transition to different pieces. So that'll be in the next video, part 2. Bye for now.